So she steps on
It is fitting that Russell be remembered by this song because this was the song that his father, my father, wrote upon his death. And it is fitting that he be remembered as with a flute transcription of that song because Russ was in fact a musician and he was a flautist. Before we start, my thanks to the Australian War Memorial for giving me a second opportunity to address this book with them. And my thanks to them for the particular contribution they made. Many of the photographs in the book, and there are a considerable number, were actually contributed by the War Memorial. For that I'm supremely grateful. My thanks to specific people, Carly Walker, Andani Pregosi, and of course to Stuart Baines, who just introduced you. Or introduced me. Somewhere buried in this audience there's a choir. And if we're very, very good, they might even sing for us. And I would ask that instead of bursting into spontaneous applause as one is wont to do when these things, when people have performed, I ask you please reserve your applause to the very, very end to give me a go. Okay. 70 years ago and 10 days, At this time, the heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra was engaged in defending herself and a huge fleet of transports that were landing troops on Guadalcanal. She was defending a concerted air attack by Japanese torpedo bombers, low-level bombers, and later on you will see just how low they were going. It was a huge thing. At 1800 hours that night, 6 o'clock that night, Canberra then went into patrol mode, where she was patrolling up and down between Solo Island and along Guadalcanal, right alongside Red Beach, where one of the landings transpired. The control line, there were 3 ships in the line ahead. It was HMAS Canberra, and USS Chicago. Australia, as the nation HMAS, Australia was called away because there was a conference that required the presence of the commander of the fleet, Admiral Crutchley. So we now had a situation where we had in the line ahead Canberra and Chicago. Chicago was actually designated as to be the senior ship, and Chicago should have actually come here for Canberra. Captain Bernay decided he would stay where he was. At 10 to 12, my brother Russell came on watch in the plot. Now the plot in a ship, in those ships, was in fact, in modern parlance, was in fact a computer room. It was used as a backup for navigation. In fact, it was used as part of the navigation of the ship. And Russell would have come on. He would have been hot. I know Anne and I have been to the Solomons. He'd have been hot. He'd have been sticky. He'd have been dog-tired. The ship had gone into action stations on the 6th of August, and they had been fighting every day since the 6th of August. That was all the 6th of August, or half the 6th of August. 7th, non-stop, and the 8th, non-stop. And at night they were on patrol duty. They were all desperately tired. Russell would have been tired, he'd have been hot, he'd have been sticky, and worse than that, he wouldn't have had a shower for about, since probably the 5th of August, so he's probably a bit tired. He had lived on sandwiches, that's all there was. The cooks were feeding guns, they were not feeding crew. At 12 o'clock, there would have been an exchange between Russell and the bridge, the navigator on the bridge, involving chronometer readings and involving coordinates. Then the ship would have turned, the order would have been issued, port 15, and the ship would have turned to port and slowly come around. Sometime later, when the appropriate moment had been arrived at, there would have been a further exchange of chronometer readings and of coordinates. And Canberra would have straightened up midships and come back on course, which is going straight down the line from which she had come. Russell was tired. He was very tired. He knew if he read, he would go to sleep. So he did something that Russell always did, sat down and started to write letters. At 1 o'clock, we would have had the same procedure. Russell would have called the coordinates, he would have called the chronometer time, the navigator would have said port 15, the helmsman would have responded, 15 a port wheel, sir, and the ship would have come around, another exchange of coordinates, and the navigator would have said to us, very good. He then addressed the helmsman and said midships, and Canberra would go back on the same course. The ship moved along. There was a steady hum of the engines. There was a steady whine of the blower fans feeding the boilers. And there was a steady movement of a ship at sea, that slap, 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 whoosh as she moved along. At about 1:01:42, Russ would have heard an airplane, just a slight hum. He would have seen a bright light light up in the scuttle out of the plot. And at 1:44, the commander of Chokai, the 8-inch Japanese cruiser, with her two 6-inch cruisers, would have ordered fire. Whereupon Canberra, having been lit up, would have been straddled by shells all round. One shell exploded out of an 8-inch gun. It arced up into the sky, a dark mass. 200 pounds of steel and TNT. As it proceeded arcing along, it would have glowed, and as it got closer and closer, the glow would have increased to bright orange. It would have arced down and detonated outside. The plot office smashed in, and Russell Keats was killed instantly by the blast from that shell. A second salvo hit the bridge, wounding and killing men in the bridge, and worse than that, the shells from the salvo would have stripped along the engine rooms, snuffing out the boilers, snuffing out the engines. 84 men were killed in that ship. They were very lucky. 84 men only were killed in that ship. 33 of them were stokers and ERAs. So almost half, in fact the entire engine crew of that ship were wiped out. The implications were horrendous. Canberra stopped dead in the water. 10,000 tonnes of British steel just went plonk, stop. She could do nothing. She could not return fire because all her gun breaches were electrically controlled. She could not turn her turrets. They had managed to get one of the turrets to port. Somebody managed to get a shell out of X turret, but she was paralysed. She had no dynamos. Everything was electrically controlled, including the fire pumps. And there she stood, a blazing, twisted mess. How could this all be? How could that ship have been so easily penetrated? It goes back to 1921, a very, very important year for this book. On August 22nd or 21, 1921, Russell was actually born. And prior to that, or around about that time, women had been given the vote. And all the major nations were actually starting to rearm. There was what was called a capital ships race, because it was learned from World War II that he who controls the seas controls the war. And that's why we won, or the Allies won, the World War I. So there was this huge capital ships race. Women had the vote. And the women said to the men, we are the ones that pick up the pieces. We are the ones that put up when our sons and our fathers and our lovers and our menfolk do not come home. We're the ones that fix them up when they come home, maimed physically and maimed mentally. Hang on, enough is enough. And men, being men, always willing to compromise, set up the Washington Treaty. And the Washington Treaty was actually imposed limitations on the number of ships that could be built by the major nations and on the configuration of those ships. And all the major nations of the time actually signed the treaty, all of them except Germany. Britain, who badly needed to rebuild her fleet, actually started to build the county heavy cruisers. She was limited to 15 heavy cruisers. They could be no more than 10,000 tonnes when launched. They could only carry 8-inch guns and 4-inch guns. The armament was limited. And because to comply with the weight restrictions, they could only be lightly armoured. They had no armour plating on them at all. Battleships prior to that had inches of armour plating all over them. The counties had no armour plating. Australia ordered 2 counties. They were in 1925, the Australian government. And the two counties were HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra, two heavy cruisers. They were subclass Kent cruisers. The Australian press got hold of this and they had a field day. Not only was Australia of the opinion, why do we need a navy? We're so remote, nobody knows we exist anyhow. And all these wars belong to Europe. Why the heck should we get involved? The current sea lanes. Okay? And the press said, these ships carry no armour. If shells get into these ships, they will create havoc and murder. It is strange that Canberra took 24 shells in 2 minutes, 24 heavy shells in 2 minutes, and only 84 men died as a result of it. Maybe there was something to be said for the counties. There was stuff to be said for the counties. They actually they could ramp up to 31 knots, 31 and a half knots. That was pretty fast, nearly 60 kilometres an hour. 10 tons of steel whipping through the waters at 60 kilometres an hour. That's something. They steered, in the words of one admiral, they steered like a picket boat. Very, very, very manoeuvrable. But they had one really bad thing. They were not armoured. When World War II began, they suddenly thought, these ships are lightly armoured, we better do something about it. And they fitted what they call a belting, an armoured belting, which would have gone around the ship and would have actually covered the engine spaces. All the counties that they produced were fitted with this armoured belting, all except HMAS Canberra. Why wasn't Canberra fitted with a belting? Because she was too busy out there working. Canberra was one of the hardest work ships that we had in World War II. We choose not to remember that. So it was that Canberra, there's Australia being led by Canberra in Jarvis Bay, quite appropriately. Canberra was ordered in 25, as I have said. She was launched in May 27 and arrived in Australia on the 16th of February 1928. And from there, that time on, she became the ship's flagship, the country's flagship, the fleet's flagship, I'll get it right yet. And she did a whole series of cruises. They had cruises named after the seasons. And it was a strange coincidence that every time Canberra on a cruise, she always managed to end up in Melbourne on Melbourne Cup Day. And she always managed to end up in Hobart on Regatta Day. Strange about that. When World War II happened, there she is, flagship off Wilson's Promontory. When World War II happened, Canberra and the other ships in the fleet were involved in escorting ships around Australia. Here she is escorting the troop ship Queen Mary. Italy came into the war, and where Canberra was just doing escorts between Sydney Harbour and Fremantle, all of a sudden Canberra found herself out in the Indian Ocean. By this time, Russell had joined her. Russell joined Canberra on the 30th or 31st of December 1940. And there she was in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean enjoys notoriety of being calm and fantastic scenery. Russell wrote to his parents, sea, sea, water, water, all around. Hot, oppressive weather, tepid nights, stars by the million, stars we never dream of at home, skies as rich a blue as possible to imagine, sunsets with every colour of the spectrum, sunsets that will give the average artist the horrors when he thought of painting them, beauty that only God can create, moons each night, big as mountains, glassy oceans fixed in glazed as 'twere. This point we're going to hear the song She Walks in Beauty in a minute, and I'm sure when Lord Byron wrote the words, cloudless climes and starry skies, he did not have the Indian Ocean in mind. And I'm equally sure that Horace Keats, when he said those words, and saw and set the lines as starry skies and cloudless climes, had no idea that he'd be talking about the Indian Ocean. Anyhow, there it is, and without any further ado, the Sydney Male Choir, She Walks in Beauty.
She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. And all that's best of dark and light meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus Lord in that tender light which have to glory day denies, one shade the more, one ray the less, hath love impaired the nameless grace, which treads in every raven's tress. Oh, softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, but smiles that win, but teeth that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent. A mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. A mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent.
In the Indian Ocean, the Germans were harrying our merchant fleets with naval ships, as in the Admiral Scheer, which you see here, and with armed merchant cruisers. And they were making considerable inroads because the nature of the operation was such that they, being not so much the Admiral Scheer, but the merchant cruisers, because of their innocent appearance, could get quite close to other ships. They would maneuver in closely, and then they would whip up the German ensign, whip down the sides of the ship, and all hell would break loose. And there was a concerted effort to get out there and to try and find these. And they were looking for the Admiral Scheer. Russell made oblique references to the Admiral Scheer, which I quote in the book. She had 11-inch guns. Canberra had 8-inch guns. Admiral Scheer could have sat back and she could have just blasted any of our ships before they got close. So it would have been a suicide mission. Fortunately, at that stage of the game, the Admiral Scheer left the Indian Ocean, but she left a whole lot of merchant ships behind, doing her dirty work for her. And we had a situation arise with Canberra where eventually they came across 2 merchant cruisers that refused to obey their signs to stop, the Canberra's orders to stop, and it transpired Canberra immediately took the view that these were enemy merchant or merchant ships, merchant cruisers. When the captains had this, a couple of the counties had or a couple of the Allied members of the Allied fleet had very bad experiences. They had come across these innocent-looking ships, come up alongside them quite close, and they had some very nasty shots inflicted. So the captains, with due discussion, thought, well, the clever way to do this is, in fact, where you see one of these vessels come up, get out a mile or so away, do as much damage to them as you can, and once you've got them nicely damaged, fired up, move in and finish the job off. Canberra came across the Kitty and the Coburg, and she ordered them to stop, and they just disobeyed, and she fired a warning shot, and they just kept doing what they were doing, so Canberra set to. She sent her walrus up as a spotter plane to see what was going on. I'm sad to say that Canberra straddled the ships, did not get one shell on board, but it gave the ships such a hell of a shock that they fired their scuttling charges, and Canberra won the day. That evening, when the steward of Captain Farkham, who was captain of Canberra at the time, congratulated him on his success, Farkham said, "Bloody bad gunnery, good Eve." He was not impressed. There was something actually wrong with their coordination. Russell wrote about the engagement, and at that stage of the game his action station was twin decks. He was a supply assistant. His action station was twin decks, and he gave quite a graphic description of what it is like to be twin decks when these actions are on. I have a pretty fair idea because I did some time in Naval Reserve myself. And I had one day in my life where I never saw the sun. We went into action stations early in the morning and didn't come out until late in the evening. And I just didn't realise how much I would miss the sun. These boys did it day in and day out. The Admiralty, in its wisdom, issued a directive. And the directive was such that when you see these merchant ships, you will close. You will not stand off at 19,000 yards and try to sink them. You will close them and get on with the job. HMAS Sydney, Captain Burnett was very aware of the Admiralty's directive. HMAS Sydney. The Cormoran, I don't have to say too much about that. HMAS Sydney and Cormoran closed and sat alongside each other and pounded themselves to death. That is the A turret of the top of HMAS Sydney. Notice how the top of the turret is missing. That gives some indication as to the severity of the action. In the meantime, around Sydney, we were blissfully unaware that the war was going on. We heard about Darwin. Oh, that was nothing, said the press. They managed to lob a bomb on the post office and a few people were killed. Nothing else. Don't worry about it. It's safe down here. So Sydney partied on. In the meantime, we had ships like the HSK Penguin, who was cruising up and down the east coast of Australia laying mines. And if you were to see a map of the east coast of Australia after World War II and see the dots where ships had sunk, the east coast of Australia was black with dots. And we didn't know a thing about it. It was going on. There was a mine, presumably laid by Penguin. In May 1942, Canberra was back in Sydney Harbour. She had been working very hard. She had come in for a refit. Canberra went for refits when she just about fell apart. Otherwise, they just kept her working. And in Sydney Harbour, on May the 31st, Sydney partied on regardless. The American sailors were in town. The girls were having a wonderful time, my sister included. And Canberra had come out of Redford, and she was there on number 1 buoy in Farm Cove. Off Sydney Heads, there were 3 large Japanese submarines, which actually carried midget submarines, and they actually carried planes. And in the evening of the 31st of May, a airplane just like that came in and flew all around Sydney Harbour, and everyone thought, ooh, pretty airplane. Nobody thought. There was some consternation about it, but very little. And flew around and had found out all they wanted to know. There were 2 heavy cruisers in Sydney Harbour at that stage of the game. There was USS Chicago, and there was HMAS Canberra. The Japanese proceeded with their midget attack, and in the course of the midget attack, Chicago fired her guns. And Russell was at home on leave at this stage of the game, and when Chicago fired her guns at a periscope that they saw, he said, those are Chicago guns, I better get back on board. Prior to that, there was a man on the boom gate, where Manly ferries used to go through every day and evening. And he was on the boom gate there, and a Manly ferry went through, and he opened the boom gate, and he saw this enormous shark going through underneath, right under this great big grey shark. So he prodded it with his blade, and it made off a metallic clang. He immediately reported it to the powers that be, and they simply said, you're drunk. That couldn't possibly be. Nothing like that could happen. Captain Bode, when he heard Chicago's guns fire off in a friendly harbour, stormed and came back in the ship, stormed into the wardroom and said, what are you doing firing your guns in a friendly harbour? And the officers, who were pretty fearful of this man, said, we saw a periscope, sir. Captain Bode's response was, you must be drunk. One thing I would ask you to do before you leave the Warman World today, 2 things I'd ask you to do. I'd ask you to go and see, hopefully, the Japanese display of the invasion of Sydney Harbour will be running. And if it is running, go and see it. It is very moving. And the other one I want you to go and see is the G for George. I speak very feelingly about G for George because my stepfather actually flew Wellingtons in World War II, and I wrote another book about him, which is up there for sale, called Just Made It. It was about his experiences in World War II. But the thing I want you to listen and note when you go to watch G for George is when they read the statistics out at the end of it, just stand there and observe the effect it has on the people watching it. It is quite horrendous, quite horrendous. Anyhow, Russell did as he said he would. He said, I must get back on board, and he had a friend at home. And they got out there and they went up to Spit Junction, which is near Moscow, to catch the tram to Windy. And while they were standing there, Russell lit 3 cigarettes with 1 match. I won't explain that. I'll explain it later if you need it. In the meantime, Russell went out to see Canberra steamed out the heads, turned north the last time. And my father had recorded with Harold Williams the song The Rose Beside the Sea. And the song had arrived in the ship, and Russell wrote, he said, many, many thanks. The record arrived today. It's excellent. It gives me much pleasure and satisfaction to sit back listening to it, knowing that it is you and yours, and believing firmly that it's the start of much more to come. Good work, Dad. Keep it up. Nothing like a rah-rah from your son. Okay, here is The Rose Beside the Sea.
When you go down the quiet roads that run beside the sea, in memory of the bygone days, I know you'll think of me. For every wave upon the shore and every seagull's cry
will speak of joys that never fade,
and love that cannot die. When you go to the harbor side and ships put out to sea, to voyage of a world away, then think a while of me.
then think a while of me.
Of me. And when the ships come back again, safe from the Roman shore,
Oh, listen what they say for me.
I'll soon be home once more. I'll soon be home once more.
I don't know if you picked it up, but in the roads beside the sea, there was the words, "Ah, listen what they say for me." Recall what happened to Russell. The guns spoke. How was Russell killed? Russell was killed by gunfire. Ah, listen what they say for me. He responded to the guns. In his last letter, as I said, Dad, good work, keep it up. And Dad did. Sydney was in one hell of a state. Here was this country that really and truly no one was interested in. All the wars had been fought in Europe. And here they were, they had the gall to come into a place. Morale was low. So Dad wrote Drake's Call. As Wendy Dixon of the Sydney Soprano said, it is a rabble rouser. And she was right, sure was. In that word, in that song, there are pertinent words again. Unguarded lay the darkened sea, as viewed by mortal eye. And yet I knew that, sight unseen, grim phantom fleets were nigh. It's just amazing. My father, when he wrote these songs, he wouldn't have had a clue. But all these songs embedded in each of the three songs we've heard today, there was a message, and every message was pertinent to what was happening to his eldest son, my brother. Ladies and gentlemen, Sydney Vale Choir, Drake's Call.
A starless night lay on the sea, the sun
drum began to play. Then with his drum I heard graceful bring out the channel over all. Foes shall hear my drum down channel, they shall hear it in the west, while a hero flag is flying till the seas are all at rest. Wheresoever fleets go sweeping for 1,000 years to come, still patrolling, loudly rolling, they shall hear Sir Francis drum. Unguarded lay the darkened sea, as viewed by mortal eye. And yet I knew by all unseen, grim phantom fleets were nigh. The drum rolled out and hid from sight, the voice of Drake rang through the night. Foes shall hear my drum down channel, they shall hear it in the west, while a dear old flag is flying till the seas are all at rest. Wheresoever fleets go sweeping for 1,000 years to come, still patrolling, loudly roaring, they shall hear Sir Francis drum.
Canberra turned north and went off on an unknown mission. They did lots of practice runs with the American Navy, and then eventually they ended up off the Solomon Islands. Why were they in the Solomon Islands? I tell you why. Because the Japanese were building an airfield there, what is now the international airport at Honiara, and that airfield was but a stepping stone to the north of Australia. So it was imperative that the Allies neutralise the airfield, in fact take it over for their own purposes. So that's why they all went there. And there was a huge fleet. Russ talks about it in a letter which is in the book. It was a huge fleet. We were going out to inflict the final victory, said Russ. And that's what happened. There they were, and they landed on Tulagai, and they landed on Red Beach in Guadalcanal, and Canberra was doing her bit. Remember I talked to you about the bombers that were there. There's Canberra off Tulagai. Look how low those airplanes were. And those planes were attacking these ships. It's just unbelievable that more ships weren't sunk. There were very few. They just managed to get out of the way. I don't know what they did, but they were quite incredible. In the meantime, the landings, all the time, the landings were being constantly interrupted by these air attacks, and they were, as you can gather, they were pretty substantial. And the result was utter chaos when they got landings. I think that's Red Beach. Trying to drop stuff on that beach, they no longer could sooner get it there than they'd have to go out and the ships would have to take off. Otherwise, the ships and the rest of the souls that weren't landed, or the rest of the gear that wasn't landed, would just be absolutely annihilated. So there they were. Unguarded lay the darkened sea, as viewed by mortal eye. You've heard it now. And that evening, on the 8th and 9th of August 1942, the ships were patrolling Canberra, Australia, Canberra, Chicago, off Guadalcanal. Australia was called away, and they had sentries, destroyer sentries posted at either end of what they call the slot. And the Jap fleet got through those sentries, and none of the sentries saw it. There was no warning issued until seconds before the Jap fleet was on top of them. And then Patterson issued a warning. The USS Patterson issued a warning. In the book, I do not go into the strategies of the whole thing. I dealt with what it was like to be in a ship during an action and what it was like to be in a ship after the action. And I did that in considerable detail. I did this because I just like people to understand. People dismiss the Navy. All the stuff, I don't want to do a row on this one, but all the stuff we hear about is all about the Army. They forget what goes on in naval ships because half the time they don't know what's happening. Okay, the Japs went by and they destroyed Canberra, left her a blazing wreck. We know about that part. They then kept going, and they took out USS Astoria, went by and they took out USS Quincy, and lastly, they saved up for the end USS Vincennes. And these were all heavy American cruisers. They were left blazing wrecks. They lost hundreds of men. Canberra lost 84, 74 went down in the ship, 10 died of wounds later. The Americans lost hundreds and hundreds of men. Look at Quincy, a fire there, with a search light on. If Russell had to be killed, being a sensitive lad, as an old friend he knew in the Navy said to me once, Russell was a square peg in a round hole. He just didn't fit the normal thing of a sailor. I'm pleased if Russell had to be killed, he was killed straight on. Because I think he would have, if he had lived and he had seen what transpired after, not only to his ship but to his friends, I don't think he would live very well with that, as did a lot of men. Okay. I paid tribute to the crew of Canberra because they were told, the order was issued by Cruxley, who wasn't present, who eventually, when he found out of her fate, said if she cannot raise steam by 0600, she is to be sunk. And they couldn't raise steam. I mean, the boilers just smashed, the engines were smashed. So they had to sink her. And many of the men, including one of the senior petty officers, said as they left the ship, she could have been towed home. Anyhow, they had to sink her. And they had the Gill's own trouble to sink Canberra. She was designed not to sink her, but Brits did a jolly good job. And they couldn't sink her, and they poured shells into her, and they hit her with torpedoes, but the Allied torpedoes didn't work very well. Finally, they got one torpedo in, which hit her in a vulnerable spot right on the bow, and the tough old Clyde cruiser turned to starboard, rolled over, and she sank. None of the men that were taken away actually saw her sink. Word of the sinking of Canberra did not get back until 20th of August. And yet, the night of the 9th, my father was awakened. And this has happened to lots and lots of people, so this is nothing new. He was awakened by an almighty gust of wind coming through the window, and the curtains blew aside, and there, standing in the window, was Russell holding his head. And Dad knew. When word got back to him, he stopped writing. He was being quite prolific. He had stopped writing. In fact, he died. Eventually, when he died, we think he died. We know he died with a broken heart. My mother, to her dying day, castigated Russ for joining up. She said he had no right to join. He was far too young. And my sister developed an implacable hatred of the Japanese, which she carries to this day in her later years. I was far too young to know what was really going on, although I knew that something was missing, and in my later years I spent many tears about Russell. Before we have Over the Quiet Waters, which we'll conclude with, I want to make a couple of points. In the book, when you buy it, you will find there's a CD in the back, and the CD has half a dozen songs on it. You only heard 4 of them today, because these ones are very, very relevant. One of the songs on there is called The Ballad of the Convict's Daughter. And the Ballad of the Convict's Daughter, which was only suitable for a soprano, it tells the story of a young man who went to war and he was sent to Crete, and his girlfriend, his lover, his fiancée, begged him not to go. And the poignant words in that song, which stick with me all the time, are, "And now he lies in Crete, at the bottom of the sea, with his hands curled up as a child would be." And I thought, how could I leave that song out? Anne and I went to the Solomon Islands. That's how I knew Russ was a sweaty mess when he came on right onto the thing. He was unbelievable. He was quite fascinating. If you've got another couple of hours, I'll tell you a story. And we went to where Camp lies, and before we went, we came here and we bought 20 poppies. And we eventually managed to convince somebody to take us out. They thought we were mildly mad, and they weren't far wrong, to take us out to drop these poppies over the site of where Canberra's sank. The 20 poppies, one for every year of Canberra's life, Russell's life. Russell died on the 9th of August. He would have turned 21 on the 22nd of August. 22nd of August, remember that date. And I went there with very, very mixed feelings. I thought, am I going to be a blubbering ass, or am I going to laugh, cry? What am I going to do? And I went there and I was fine. I just dropped 3 poppies over the side, and Anne kept saying, for God's sake, it was serious. And anyhow, so I did that. But I came away with one thought. They sank Canberra. There were 74 men in that ship. And before they sank her, none of the crew would leave that ship. And this is Navy for you. None of the crew would leave that ship until they had combed her from stem to stern to make sure there were no wounded left on board. And so she went down with 74 men in. 10 men died after on the way home as a result of wounds in that ship, and they were buried at sea. And I thought, as we were poised over there with the wreck of Canberra, I thought, well, at least we know where Russell is. I can tell my children and my grandchildren, or we can tell our grandchildren and grandchildren where Russell is. And those 10 men, they will never know where they are. Dad wrote one more song. It was called Over the Quiet Waters. You've already heard it in the flute arrangement. You will now hear Over the Quiet Waters with the Sydney Male Choir.
While the weary earth
The pertinent words in that song are the very last words. Someday you'll come to me. Once more, my father wouldn't have realised the implications of those words when he said them. Certainly Herbert Brennan wouldn't have realised it either. My father, Russell's father, my father, died on the 21st of August 1945, one day before his eldest son's birthday. If Russell had lived, he would turn 24 on that day. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Sydney Male Choir, its conductor, Dr. Houston Daly. The pianist for this occasion, Bethany Morris. The soloists, in order of appearance, Brian Lawler, Neil Village, Lee Owens, Tom Coughlin, Wolfgang Taylor, Bill Maxwell, Damien Blackburn, Kevin Berg. Ladies and gentlemen, the Sydney Male Choir. Finally, one final word. None of this would have happened without the support and superb organising ability of my right hand. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Beth, you've got 5 minutes to ask questions, otherwise Houston's going to kill me slowly after. Yep. Does anyone have any questions? Are you guys pretty thorough? No? No, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed.
So did you press stop? No.
It's only just stopped.
Okay.
Like, the second you knocked on the door.